doing today? All right, so I'm going to welcome you to our March Hungry for History program. I think I know most faces in here. I'm Luciana Spracher. I'm the director of the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives. And before we get started, I'm going to ask you if you will turn off or mute your cell phones. And I don't have a microphone or speaker in this room, so I will try to speak loudly, and actually you guys are good, you all sat close up, so that's great. But let me know if I start to get too quiet for you, okay? So today I'm going to be sharing with you an update on our multi-year research project to examine the City of Savannah government's use of slavery to perform important municipal work. Through the city's historical financial records, this project has documented the city government as an enslaver. It's begun to identify enslaved workers by name. It's examined the city's use of the hiring out system, and it's highlighted specific projects and departments that have been supported by enslaved labor. And I'll also talk about next steps for this project. We're not done yet. We'll be covering a very dark period in the city government's history and looking at historical records that document humans as property with little regard for their humanity and contributions to our organization and community. The Municipal Slavery Research Project's #1 goal is to recognize these individuals as important members of the city organization, city employees that came before us, and their role in our government's history and success. So this project officially started in 2014, but the seeds were planted in the preceding years. In 2007, Savannah City Council, responding to calls from the public to address the city's role in slavery, adopted a resolution acknowledging the city's participation in slavery and the use of enslaved individuals to establish and build up Savannah. In support of City Council's resolution, the Municipal Archives mounted an online exhibit titled Slavery in Savannah, Intersections with Local Government. And I want to recognize Glenda Anderson, who was the director of our archives at that time, and the two of us worked on that together. So this exhibit discussed slavery in colonial and antebellum Savannah, but it was not an exhaustive review of city records and lacked details on specific individuals. The effort, both the resolution and our exhibit, was really reactive, and therefore the work on the exhibit was really kind of hurried in response as council was doing this. It's also no longer available online as it did not survive the last website platform migration the city underwent, though we still have all of the content available in the archives. Research for the exhibit touched on the city's involvement in the institution of slavery in three main ways: as a slave owner, purchasing, selling, and insuring enslaved people, by generating revenue through the taxation of residents who held enslaved people as property, and by enacting local laws and ordinances that were designed to control the activities and maintain the second-class status of both enslaved people and free people of color. A couple of examples of the records presented in this exhibit include a City Council resolution from 1806, which you see at the top of this slide. In it, the health officer requested permission from council to sell an enslaved man named Morris to defray expenses incurred while he was confined in the city hospital with smallpox. City Council approved this request and authorized Morris to be sold at public auction. On the bottom is an entry from the 1863 Tax Digest, which records personal property the city levied taxes on. In this example, George L. Cope and his wife, they are listed as owning 6 slaves over the age of 12 years and 1 under the age of 12. These humans are listed as property along with their horse, carriage, and furniture. You can't see the amount of taxes collected in this image. It's cut off to the right. But the horse was taxed at $5, the carriage at $10, the 6 older enslaved people at $18 together, and the younger enslaved person at 50 cents. Along with $5 on the furniture, the city collected a total of $38.50 on the Cope's property. Using an inflation calculator, the city received about the equivalent of $971 in today's money, 466 of which was for the human property they were reporting. And while the exhibit highlighted the city as a beneficiary of the institution of slavery, for me it just emphasized the need for a more in-depth project to identify enslaved city workers and their specific contributions. So as I've used the city collections for local history projects, assisted researchers with their own projects, I've noticed a clear oversight and documentation regarding the city's workforce. The traditional records that summarize city accomplishments, struggles, and efforts always focus on that top tier of city leadership, the elected and appointed officials, but no mention of the boots on the ground that are actually completing the work that made these men at the top look good. I also noticed that while many of our collections were considered fully described and open to the public for research with their finding aids and inventories, lacked meaningful information that provided researchers insight on the wealth or depth of knowledge and information they contained. This is an example of what we call a finding aid, which is an inventory of the records. So repeatedly, as we use these records, we would run across valuable information, particularly in the city's financial records, that I knew people would want, but unless they were really a hardcore researcher, they would never dive into. And so this is an example of the finding aid for the cash books. This description tells you exactly what it is. It's a record of financial transactions, including the date, the source of funds, the department, the amount and totals. But nothing in this description would tell you what you could find out, that the city paid a boy to serve as a drummer going through town to warn a fire, or that the city paid a woman to sew a pillow for the president's official visit, or that the city was purchasing, selling, and leasing enslaved persons to complete almost all of our infrastructure and sanitation work. And that's what we're seeing in the actual records. The city's financial records, dating back to 1806, are among the least utilized of all of our collections. Researchers and students are reluctant to put in the time necessary to read through daily and monthly line item entries. It's like reading your checkbook. It doesn't sound very sexy, right? They prefer to jump to those annual summaries and reports that rarely provided meaningful detail, but would tell you Mayor so-and-so built this road. Well, he didn't, right? So the municipal archives, we're tasked not only with preserving and providing access to the city's historical records, but also sharing Savannah's layered and complicated history with our staff, residents, and visitors. Discussions of the city's use of enslaved workers had always been very minimal based on these annual reports and our older published histories, which largely ignore the contributions of this group of city workers. So to rectify that, the archives needed to dive deep into its own records and stop waiting for those researchers to do it for us. So all these seeds were sown and finally came together in 2014 when Lacey Brooks, a graduate student at Armstrong State University, approached us looking for her graduate internship. The Municipal Slavery Research Project officially began, and it quickly became obvious that this project was bigger than one student and one semester. Lacey decided to narrow her focus from all enslaved workers to only those that were owned by the city. Lacey was a former accountant, and she meticulously reviewed all extant financial records through the end of the Civil War, and particularly the city treasurer's cash books and annual settlement books. And she identified instances of the city purchasing and selling enslaved people. She supplemented the financial records with supporting documentation in the city council, meeting minutes, annual reports, and deeds. And here you can see the 1830 purchase of Chance, Monday, and Bob for $662.25 as reported in the annual settlement book. This is equivalent to about $22,867 if we're looking at today's money. So Lacey's internship resulted in several final products that have been heavily utilized since, including a research summary where she outlined her work with recommendations for next steps, an online exhibit, which you can see a snapshot on the right, where she presented her findings for the public, and a brochure summarizing her results. This is her brochure, though we have supplemented it since. And there's copies over there on the table. Her project identified the city's extensive use of the hiring out system to support municipal work and recommended a path for a phase 2 project focused on that. When we launched the online exhibit and announced the project to the public, it received extensive attention and coverage from both local media and our own leadership. The project and the city as a sponsor was celebrated for contributing meaningful information about Savannah's history. The final products presented the information in an easily digestible format, but also told you what the records say and mean, and therefore did not result necessarily in the uptick of people using the original records and analyzing them for themselves as we had hoped. So phase one resulted in the identification of 11 men who were enslaved by the city with documented purchases between 1830 and 1864. Lacey was able to identify the names of 5 of these men, with 6 men only identified through the department they worked for and their purchase or sale date. We've since identified 2 of them by their first name. The identified men were Chance, Monday, Bob, Ben, Joe, London, and Alec. They primarily worked for the scavengers department, and that's the city's early sanitation department, as well as in the waterworks department. Lacey's research led us off on a few tangents, as is known to happen when you work in the archives. 3 areas she focused on, including learning more about the scavengers and their care, which included documenting the old city lot, which was also called the city pound. And I found this particularly interesting since we've also tracked the history of the city lot, which we just relocated off to move to this site. So what we think of as city lot is where the old waterworks building is at the corner of Stiles and Gwinnett. But her research documented 2 earlier lots, one just south of Colonial Park Cemetery, which is now a small park, followed by one off of West Boundary Street. So in 1854, City Council approved a resolution to remove the scavengers' dwelling, where these men were held and lived, from Colonial Park to make room for a superintendent's house. And then we see the development of the West Boundary Street scavengers lot. And this is a plan from 1888, the one on the sort of middle there, 1888, and shows that there's now stables and barns as well as one dwelling. So this is after the period of emancipation, but it's likely before the end of the Civil War, the enslaved labor of the scavengers department was also living on this site. She also documented the use of Africans from the captured slave ship, the Antelope, by the city. While the case of the Antelope was working its way through the federal courts, and the courts were determining if they would be considered slave property or not, the city marshal, John Morrell, put many of these unfortunate Africans that were considered in limbo to work. So to that end, the city took custody of 51 people and used them in leveling fortifications left over from the War of 1812. They also pulled weeds in our squares. On the lower portion of the screen is an entry from the 1820 cash book, and you can see where the city paid an effigy for clothing the Africans from the Antelope. We also tracked payments for medicine and medical care for them. Based on the findings and recommendations from phase 1 that Lacey completed, I immediately started looking for the next intern to continue the work, but sometimes it's hard to find the right fit for the right project. And we started at least 3 times with different interns who dropped out for various reasons. In the end, decided that this project is too important to keep putting it on the side burner. So in 2022, we hired a paid contractor to get us back on track, and that was Mark Odell. Mark basically repeated Lacey's path through all the financial records from scratch, but this time he was looking through the lens of the hiring out system, or the leasing system, in which the city paid enslavers for the use of their enslaved labor. Mark documented every time, every instance the city paid for outside labor, and further revealed how enslaved individuals fit into the city's overall workforce, the department they worked for, worked with, and the jobs they performed. He was able to provide additional information about the men that Lacey had identified in phase 1, including this 1844 ad offering $10 reward for the apprehension of Joe, who was owned by the city, who was well known around town because he drove one of the scavengers' carts. So he was able to put a name on one of the enslaved men that we had not been able to identify by name in phase 1. It's often a struggle in the archives between our various hats. As historians, we tend to want to analyze the records ourselves and tell you what it all means. As archivists, we want you to dive into the primary sources and make up your own mind what they mean. So for phase 1, we analyzed it. For phase 2, the final product was a dynamic spreadsheet that allows researchers to sort and analyze the data for their own projects. Similar to phase 1, phase 2 identified paths and goals for future phases of the project, including the researching the enslavers the city paid through tax digest to get a better understanding of the system and extent of urban slavery in Savannah, as well as targeted research examining the city's transition to the use of penal labor after the abolition of slavery. My hope to encourage people to analyze the data for themselves seems to have fallen flat, including with our local media. We pushed the project out the same way we did phase 1, but not one local media source covered it. We haven't seen more people reaching out to us to discuss the spreadsheets or request to see the original records. And I think it's shown us that not providing people with easily digestible a final product was a mistake. Apparently people really want you to tell them what it all means, right? So we're kind of revisiting that. But I want to tell you, what does it all mean a little bit, right? So Mark's work resulted in incredible data. He transcribed over 4,000 entries from our financial records. His work not only identified those laborers who were rented or hired out from others, but also enslaved people who were able to hire themselves out and keep their wages. Mark identified 26 relevant keywords and provided information on when certain terms were used in city records, which is really useful for future research projects and researchers coming in. So there you see just a couple of examples, and they change over time. He's looking at, 60 plus years of data. Sometimes we're using the word hands versus labor. We switch from using the word Negro to slave. So when do you use certain keywords at certain times? You also see, we only identified 11 individuals the city owned, but over 4,000 instances where we're paying other people for their enslaved labor. So the city's making use of the hiring out system much more extensively than actually being the enslaver who owns the individuals themselves. So I have not counted up the number of unique names this project identified. This is a very short list here that you see on the left. But as a snapshot, between 1826 and 1828, the city paid a Mary E. Long multiple times for the services of an enslaved man named Damon to drive the city wagon. Throughout the 1830s and 1850s, the city paid for the labor of numerous enslaved men to work in the scavengers department, including Will, Casino, Cato, Jim, and Anthony, among many others. Some workers were used for an assortment of tasks, like John. He was hired out from a P.K. Shields, who worked in Laurel Grove Cemetery. He also worked with the city pumps, as well in the scavengers department. The city used enslaved labor to build and repair roads, clear roads of weeds, trash or dead animals, fight fires, develop public property like Laurel Grove Cemetery and Forsyth Park, and work on local fortification projects. The contributions of these men to the improvement of Savannah's infrastructure, parks, squares, and public spaces cannot be overemphasized. As part of his work, Mark emphasized how the city's financial records could be used as a springboard to learn more about key moments in Savannah's history. He encouraged people who are researching a variety of topics not to rule out these financial resources, and as they say, follow the money. All of the events listed here are well documented in the cash books. And actually, we just celebrated the anniversary of Marquis de Lafayette's visit. So leading up to his visit, there's a lot of payments being made in preparation for his visit in 1825. And along those same lines, Mark uncovered two events in city history that had been all but forgotten. On his own, he became very intrigued, and he took the nuggets he found in the cash books and then did additional research to reintroduce the history of three men who died in the line of duty for the city. The first was James Houston, a free person of color that died while fighting a fire at Worthington Gale's house on Johnson Square in 1825 as part of the Union Axe and Fire Company. This casualty was documented in the cash books because the city paid for the funeral expenses, including a coffin, grave digging, and black crepe. We don't have fire department records for 1825, so Mark's discovery of payments was an excellent example of filling in the gaps when the most logical resources are missing. Similarly, he found two police officers that were murdered by a fellow police officer in 1866. 2 years before the deaths of police officers Bryson and Reed, who were considered Savannah's first fallen officers and widely recognized as such in histories and memorials. In 1866, officers Edward McNichols and James Foley were shot to death by off-duty officer James Bartley while they were trying to break up a drunken brawl on the corner of West Broad and Liberty Streets. Bartley, whose real name was George Grady, who apparently used a number of aliases, was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at the state prison in Milledgeville. Like the death of James Houston, Mark found this forgotten story through accounting records which showed the city paid for their funerals. His research and documentation of these events led to the men being recognized in the annual memorial services by the city. Now you see a picture of him at one of those. And the police officers has since been added to the state and national police officer memorials. So real tangible results of this type of research and what we hope for our enslaved laborers documented in this project, that they be recognized for their sacrifices and contributions to the community. As a follow-up to Mark's work in Phase 2, Hannah Dinning, a SCAD intern studying architectural history, completed her final internship with us last fall. Hannah took Mark's work and analyzed that data to identify specific infrastructure and construction projects that she then fleshed out through additional resources like city council records and newspapers. This phase is important as it gives us tangible projects that we can point to around town and discuss the role of enslaved labor in their completion. It can help us develop new interpretation and heighten people's awareness and appreciation. Hannah started broadly, organizing the data that Mark had found to pinpoint construction projects, like you see here on the left, with Springfield Plantation and the Perry Street Sewer. And then she had to further narrow down which projects to focus on based on available records. Her research identified 1,000 potential infrastructure projects. She selected 7 projects to focus on during her internship, and she prepared her own brochure summarizing her research, which you can pick up before leaving. Her methodology provides a roadmap for researchers to follow who want to examine other projects. So for all of the students, for Mark, Lacey, Hannah, they all did methodology reports. So other people that are interested can look at how they conducted their research so they can conduct their own research. One item that Hannah found that I was really interested to learn about was an 1810 census or survey of enslaved males between the ages 16 and 45 years that were available to level the streets. So City Council authorized and paid for the survey, which was completed by our City Marshal at the time, William Maxwell. Fortunately, we have not yet found the record of the survey results, but we know the survey was completed. And this, if we can track it down, which we are still working on, this would be a great record of males in 1810. This is a great example. Mark had this in his analysis. Hannah then took the little nugget in Mark's work, found City Council meeting minutes, items in the newspaper that confirmed the survey was paid for and completed. So the next step, hopefully, is one day we'll find this survey. So slowly, through all these phases of the project, we're building more and more understanding of what the city government was doing, when, and why. Last summer, we also had an undergrad intern from Georgia Southern help us get started on Phase 4. This phase is focusing on the participation and role of our former mayors in the institution of slavery, more from the perspective of their personal and business relationships, rather than their role as the city's executive leader. Through this phase, we hope to learn more about our leaders to provide a more complete and nuanced view of their impact on Savannah, including a better understanding of the decisions made when they were mayor. We can no longer view these men just through their own annual reports and the highlights they provided of their own administration, where they tell you why they are important, or the secondary sources that are currently available that were mostly put out in the late 19th century. We need to look more critically at them. So I'll be honest, we struggled a little bit with this internship, both the intern and the supervisor, right? It was a fully remote internship. We were working with an undergrad rather than a graduate student who was new to historical research, and a communications major rather than a history major. So it was a big learning curve for all of us. So we didn't get too far along, but we did learn a little bit about how we might approach this phase. So we got through the first 10 years, but we're going to be picking it up in-house with our archivists. And this phase, we looked at examining both city collections like tax digests, as well as external collections like census records, newspapers, and estate records. So here's an example of an 1813 tax digest, which shows former Mayor Thomas Gibbons reporting 7 slaves for which he was taxed by the city $5.25, or about $104 today. So the final product that we're hoping to get out of this phase would include a concise report, which an example is there on the left, which can be something easily digestible by the public, but that would summarize each mayor's role in slavery, like what their slave holdings were, that would be documented through tax records. And again, this is Thomas Gibson, that was mayor in the 1790s. He owned several cotton and rice plantations outside of the city. So in addition to looking at city records that would only document his holdings within the city limits, we would also, want to look at his holdings outside the city. And we would hope that we could also prepare a research guide that would help someone else that might want to research an individual and their slave holdings, give them a path forward. So we did something similar for the World War I centennial. We had an intern research Savannah's World War I casualties and prepare a database, but a research guide so that somebody could, research somebody else. And they prepared a how do you research World War I soldiers, a guide. That's probably gotten more use than their actual research on our World War I casualties. So our hope is to have the information about mayors, but then also a path for somebody else that wants to research somebody. So we hope to have that maybe by the end of 2025 this year. And then what would be some future phases we're looking at? Even with all the work's been done, there's still we still lack a lot of information about our enslaved workers. The hiring out documentation provided us a lot of information about their enslavers. So one way we could learn more about that labor force is by researching their enslavers. So this research would be similar to how we're looking at the mayors, but we would instead be looking at the enslavers, right? Going and looking at the tax digest and the estate records and hoping to get more detailed information about the individuals that they are holding. So we had one of our former archivists, Molly Rowe. She identified 2 enslavers that were in Mark's research from 2 different time periods that the city hired their enslaved labor for, and she researched them through property and tax records. So a brief summary of her research on Mary E. Long, who I mentioned before. So Mary E. Long leased an enslaved person on 14 different occasions to the city between 1825 and 1836 for the use by the streets, docks, and scavengers departments. Through Molly's research, we know that Mary was the widow of Michael Long, who died in 1824. And on his death certificate, he was marked as employed as a scavenger. They owned between 3 and 14 enslaved people between 1821 and 1842. So hopefully we can take this a little bit further, looking at their estate records and slave census records, to at least start getting some names and ages of these individuals. So I think we can keep going and picking at this a little bit more and hopefully getting more actual names of individuals. Another phase we're looking at, Mark's research extended a year beyond the end of the Civil War to capture the transition of the city's labor force after emancipation. Here's a snapshot of his spreadsheet showing the early use of chain gangs by the city. Examining this transition more extensively is planned for a future phase, but in the meantime, Kelly, and she'll wave over here, she put together a captive labor research guide to assist researchers interested in both the use of slavery, but also penal labor by the city. This guide is available on our website and includes records that we've just run across, sometimes by accident, sometimes because we were seeking them out over the years, including Park and Tree Commission minutes, city court and jail records, which document people being sentenced to labor and sent to the county farm. Also city annual reports and city council minutes. I printed out some copies, but on our website, all those blue links are hyperlinked to the collections that we have found examples of the city's records and documentation of the use of captive labor.
What year was that?
The transition?
All this slave, this gang.
We went immediately, and I'll actually talk about that in just 1 second. Like, as soon as we couldn't enslave people, we're moving right into
Penal labor.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
So here's a few examples of those records that you can find through that research guide. So I'm going to start in the upper right and then move counterclockwise. So in the upper right is snapshot from the mayor's 1866 annual report, and there are comments about the transition of labor forces. So one quote: "One of the noticeable features growing out of the changed condition of affairs has been the introduction during the past year of the chain gang as an institution upon our streets and public works. This force is rapidly accumulating in numbers and is made up of convicts sentenced to labor by the courts. It already exceeds the wants of the city." So the city lost one forced labor group, and they moved right into finding another labor group, okay? On the top left, this is the Park and Tree Commission minutes from 1896, and it mentions the possibility of securing convict labor for use in Colonial Park. And they do have, if you see, there's little kind of notations in the left that tell you, what that entry is about. And this one jumped out because it says convict labor. Not that long ago, I was using them, and labor was popping up, and I was like, oh, we need to look for all the times where it says labor now too. Like convict labor, that's just too obvious. We need to be a little bit more subtle in what we're looking for. So I think this resource, the Park and Tree Commission minutes, is probably an untapped source for this convict labor and penal labor. So it's prime for an indexing project.
That says 1986.
Oh, that's a typo. It's 1896. That's my fault. 1896. Ooh, thank you.
Surprise.
Lower left, this is a page from an unpublished and anonymous manuscript that was given to local civil rights leader and historian W.W. Law. It's titled "Trapped in Georgia, My Life." In it, the writer describes his arrest, sentencing, and the treatment and condition of chain gangs imprisoned at the county farm, which was in the vicinity of Bacon Park off of Eisenhower Drive. It's a very interesting read. I wish we knew exactly where it came from. And then the last image is from Olaf Otto Sr.'s scrapbook. Otto was a local engineer and contractor, and this image shows a chain gang working on a road leading up to a new bridge over the Savannah River in the 1920s. So Kelly Sokovic, who's our senior archivist, shared two newspaper articles with me recently that she had run across. Both are from the Savannah Daily Herald during early January 1896. So as I mentioned, just after we have come out of the Civil War. And I wanted to read you some quotes for them. On January 1st, 1866, the paper provided the following report. On Saturday last, 5 Negroes convicted of larceny, etc., before Judges O'Byrne and Bardwell, the Freedmen's Court, were placed at work on Drayton Street, having each a chain and ball attached to his right leg. The chain gang will be increased from day to day as the preservation of good order demands. Offenders of the laws who are not able to pay their fines, either white or black, will be placed at work on the streets. A week later, there was a published update. Judges O'Byrne and Bardwell of the Freedmen's Court have adopted a punishment which it is hoped will have a good effect in deterring freedmen from the commission of crime. Under the new regulation, the crime for the commission of which the offender is sentenced to work on the streets with a ball and chain is stated on a placard which is fastened on his back, where it may be read by all passers-by. It is hoped that this mode of punishment will have the desired effect in restraining the viciously inclined. These articles bring up lots of questions for me, like what entity does the Freedmen's Court fall under? Who are these judges? How many white men were sentenced to the chain gang in 1866 versus African American men? Were these play cards common in other communities? So as you can see, chain gangs and convict labor are definitely something we need to look more into. So as you can see, our Municipal Slavery Research Project has been in the works for years and has many paths still to travel down, each one no doubt leading us to another path to better document and share not only the city's use of forced labor, but helping to identify and put names and faces to all our workers so they can get the recognition for the important work they did for so many years that has resulted in the Savannah that we know and love. So happy to answer any questions. It's a very complicated but important project, and I think one that probably will never be done, but one that we hope to continue to chip away on for years and years. And again, I have all of the things in the back. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking when you were talking about the chain gangs, I'm curious as to how fast the increasing conviction rate, you know, all of a sudden, oh, we need labor, well, let's just start hauling people in and start convicting them. And was it jury trials? Was it just judges deciding? I mean, you know, the correlation on the numbers of people. But my other question is, earlier when you were saying that not many people use that second phase, and I get it, because especially if it's an unbiased professional opinion that can help explain to me, I'm good with that, because I don't have the expertise, like you said, a historian or you know, somebody who's used to interpreting different works, that I'm fine with, as long as there's no bias. What does this mean? You know, and open other questions. But are some of the local houses not, you know, there's so much research being done with the various historic homes in Savannah. Are they not going to you for research to know, like, you know, we were just talking, our students go to the Owen Thomas, which has this wonderful, you know, they've got a lot of names now of the different enslaved people there. They're really trying to do more research. Are they working with you guys? Are they doing their own? Are they working with historical?
Yes,
I'm sure it's all
okay, you said a whole lot in there. So the most recent question you asked, yes, they do come to us to do research. And so we do have students and we have house museums coming to us to do targeted research. So I think, you know, maybe what I was hoping to see is somebody who wanted to now analyze trends and things like that. We haven't seen, it doesn't mean they're not gonna, these people aren't gonna come. But in terms of, like, you know, we've had people coming to us to research convict labor and those trends, so we've learned a lot. You know, sometimes we don't know about our records until the researchers come and start using them in new ways. Okay, now let me try to backtrack to what your first question was. Oh, in terms of how quickly the convict labor, penal labor system grew, we haven't dived completely into that. A lot of that's coming, like, state and like county systems, all kind of working off of each other. So I don't know that I can fully answer that question, but it was moving fairly quickly, and it's like working around with the federal government, like, well, they're taking this away from us and we're gonna do workarounds, and it's gonna move, and it moved very quickly. So, and there was some pretty nasty, I was trying to find, there was another article that Kelly had found that basically was like, oh, we're so proud of this judge for getting us all these people. It was like, the judges were deliberately building up this workforce for the city. Yeah.
Along that vein, I believe the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery carved out an exception for penal labor. So they were thinking ahead, and that was a union, Northern Congress, that passed the 13th Amendment. There weren't any Confederates in the Congress at that time. Mm-hmm. So they were thinking ahead about convict labor, and they carved that out of the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. That, you know, truly a judge guilty or whatever.
Yeah, there's I mean, for us, we haven't gone down that path yet to really fully understand how it was happening at this local level, but it was moving really fast, and we can see it in the financial records.
What do we know about the Freedmen's Courts?
So we don't have those records, because that's not, like, our records in the city archives are city government records, so I can't answer that question. Anybody else? Well, I hope in, you know, another 2 years to give another update about where we've gotten next. So I want to thank you all, and give us your feedback. We've got an online, how was this program? What would you like to see in your future programs? There's also the QR code over there. I very much appreciate your feedback. So, thank you.